Um, there's a troubling bit of research from social science, specifically sociology, as it relates to the epidemiology of suicide. Um, and in the 21st century, it's very important to notice this. Um, um, because a lot of communities have developed online, it's increased the amount of anxiety and depression in the global community. And most internet users being men, because the internet has no girls, which is, it's one of the rules of the internet apparently, um, suggest that male socialization, the male loneliness pandemic, has only grown over time. And the attempts to get men to socialise by being offline didn't work with the COVID-19 lockdowns because they were trapped in their houses and they spent more time on message boards and playing computer games than actually working. So it actually furthered their isolation tactics and drove them towards strategies whereby they would have working from home jobs and stuff like that. And so typically you find men born between the years of about 1970 and about 1995 are at higher risk of suicide due to lacking any sense of community whatsoever. You typically find those individuals might LARP as young men between the ages of 17 and about 24 on websites like 4chan because they undergoing a midlife crisis whereby they acknowledge that their virility is no longer functional as a consequence of long-term alcohol usage or drug use is associated with their loneliness. Some in recent times, you'll probably find that Christian nationalism has emerged in some communities, and other forms of religious extremism as a means to try and get men to go back to religious communities and communicate with others. Unfortunately, though, because due to the extremism of those communities, they haven't actually been able to socialise properly. Instead, they've been radicalised towards political and social movements that cause them to become more borderline personality disordered and living in greater states of anxiety and despair. As a consequence of that, the male suicide rate is on the increase. You'll probably find men born between the years 1970 and 1995 are at particularly high risk of suicide. You probably find what's interesting about that is that the warmer the climate they live in, the more likely that it is to be the case. So men that are close to the equator or in subtropical zones or desert regions are particularly prone to that particular type of issue. The reason for that is because there's a sort of paradox associated with the equatorial regions. People expect to have higher rates of community engagement as a consequence of there being a greater population there, but actually they're experiencing further isolation as a consequence of technological revolution. And as a consequence of that and several different market forces and changes to society associated with women not putting up with being property anymore, they have a tendency towards blaming society and its ills and resorting to radicalism and extremism. Subtropical locations that are not equatorial and desert regions are also prone to that, but only here the desert regions aren't deserts proper. So if you talk about desert regions that are sort of within range of a plains area or mountain range or that sort of thing, but not proper sandy deserts, so places with a reasonable sized population that do have greater access to other towns and communities of a similar size, they seem to be a greater risk than the remotest communities, because in the remotest of communities they typically socialise with the people around them and subsequently do have a sense of community. But in towns and townships and cities where there are more than 500 people, typically you find those individuals have a higher rate of suicide, or those men have a higher rate of suicide because they're not engaging in social activities. When the men engage in social activities in those environments, typically you find because they've been radicalised by internet usage, they engage in Machiavellian behaviour that means the other men don't trust them. As a consequence, those men might temporarily appease them, but ultimately push them away. And those men are driven further into despair in their private environments as they gradually increase the risk of their suicide. As a consequence, radicalisation of men towards the alt-right pipeline in particular is increasing the male suicide rate. And we expect, and unfortunately, based on that research, we expect the male suicide rate to not be 1 in 5 in Australia over the next 5 years, but closer to one. Not 1 in 5. Sorry, for 5 people per day in Australia. We're expected to be closer to 20. Globally, a similar increase is expected of approximately 4 times the amount as a consequence of that. With difference in region, more remote regions being less likely to have it as a consequence of them being relying on those other people around them and having less access to technology. We're sorry about that, and particularly men in urban environments that might be prone to using Reddit or 4chan or similar types of sites associated with social gaming are particularly high risk. Based on the sociological research thus far, we suspect that Thomas Matthew Crooks had been radicalised by a similar website and possibly recruited by Elon Musk or someone similar to fake Donald Trump's assassination through the radicalisation process. And in effect, his behaviour was suicide by cop. We're sorry to report this. Have a nice day. And be well and get help.